Pop quiz. How many different meanings can Jerusalem have in the Bible? You've said one, you'd be wrong. At least according to 1,000 years of Christian interpretation. According to the medieval church, Jerusalem has 4 meanings. It's a literal city. It represents the church. It represents your soul. And it represents heaven. 4 meanings from one word, all at the same time. Now think about that for a second. If one word can legitimately mean 4 different things, who gets to decide which meaning applies when? The preacher? The reader? Your small group leader? Welcome to the Quadriga, the 4-level interpretation system that dominated Christianity for a millennium. And here's the part that should concern you. It's still alive today. You just don't hear people use the Latin names anymore. By the way, I'm St. Daniel, the patron saint of provocation, provoking people to learn and study like Jesus did. If you're new here at Bible Study Steps, we teach you how to interpret Scripture accurately, how to ask the hard questions, and how to get to what the text actually means. So if you're ready to stop guessing and start knowing, you're in the right place. In the last 2 videos, we watched the battle between Alexandria and Antioch, allegory versus literal interpretation. Today, we're going to see what happened after that battle. Spoiler alert, allegory won for about a millennium. Here's the twist. Right in the middle of the medieval period, a group of scholars said, wait, this isn't working. And they started the process that led directly to the Reformation. Today's video is a bridge from the early church to the Middle Ages to the Reformation. And by the end, you're going to understand why the reformers had to break free from this system. Let's start with a man you've probably heard of, Augustine. Augustine is one of the most influential theologians in church history. And when it came to biblical interpretation, he tried to find a middle ground between Alexandria and Antioch. Here's what he said. The historical fact is real. The events in the Bible actually happened. That's good. But if the literal sense seems to command an immorality, an absurdity, or something contrary to love, then you should look for a figurative or spiritual meaning. Augustine called this the principle of charity. Now that sounds reasonable, right? If something seems morally wrong, maybe there's a deeper meaning. But here's the problem. Who decides what counts as absurd or immoral? The interpreter. And that opens the door right back to subjectivity. Let me give you Augustine's own example. The 4 rivers of Eden in Genesis. Augustine said, sure, those were real rivers, but the mere description of rivers is insufficient as the theological message. So the rivers actually represent the 4 cardinal virtues: prudence, temperance, courage, and justice. Do you see what just happened? Augustine affirmed the historical fact, but then said the primary message was spiritual. And just like that, we're back to allegory. The text didn't signal allegory. The grammar didn't demand it. The context didn't require it. Augustine decided the literal sense was insufficient, so he added a spiritual layer. Once you accept that logic, there's no stopping point. Any passage can be allegorized if the interpreter feels the literal sense isn't rich enough. Augustine also introduced something called the rule of faith. This was a constraint. He said no passage could be interpreted in a way that contradicted the clear teachings of Scripture or the established doctrines of the church. That's a safeguard. It's better than what Origen had, but it still doesn't solve the core problem. How do you know what the text means before you apply the rule of faith? You need an objective method first. Augustine's authority was so massive that his approach became the default for the Western Church. The literal sense is real, but the spiritual sense is primary. And that set the stage for what came next, the Quadriga. In the medieval period, scholars took Augustine's framework and formalized it into a 4-level system. They called it the Quadriga, which means 4-horse chariot. There's even a famous Latin poem that summarizes it. Let me translate that for you. The letter teaches what happened. Allegory teaches what you should believe. Morality teaches what you should do. Analogy teaches where you're going. Let me break that down. Level 1, the literal sense. This teaches what happened, the historical facts. Level 2, the allegorical sense. This teaches what you should believe, doctrine often about Christ or the church. Level 3, the moral or tropological sense. This teaches what you should do, ethics and conduct. Level 4, the anagogical sense. This teaches where you're going, eschatology and your final destiny. So any passage of Scripture could have 4 different meanings, all layered on top of each other. Let me show you how this worked. Let's take Jerusalem. The literal sense, Jerusalem is a historical city in Palestine. In the allegorical sense, Jerusalem represents the church on earth. In the moral sense, Jerusalem represents the human soul, which must be purified. In the anagogical sense, Jerusalem represents heaven, the eternal city. Now here's the question. Which one is right? The medieval answer was all of them. They're all true at the same time. Do you see the problem? If Jerusalem can mean 4 different things depending on what lesson you want to teach, then the text has lost its objective control. The author's intent disappears. Grammar doesn't matter. The historical context is just the starting point, not the boundary. This system dominated the church for centuries. Preachers loved it because you could get 4 sermons out of 1 verse. But scholars started to get nervous. By the 12th and 13th centuries, something called scholasticism was rising. This was an academic movement that wanted to harmonize faith and reason. They rediscovered Aristotle, and Aristotle cared about logic and objectivity. Scholars like Andrew of St. Victor and Nicholas of Lyra started saying, wait, we need to prioritize the literal sense. We need to consult the original Hebrew text. We need Jewish commentaries to understand the historical context. Nicholas of Lyra was especially important. He insisted on the plain meaning. He studied Hebrew, he consulted Jewish rabbis, and he said the literal sense must control the meaning. This was a direct return to Antiochian principles. But the most important figure was Thomas Aquinas. Aquinas was famous for his systematic theology, and when it came to hermeneutics, he made a decisive move. He said, only the literal sense can be used as the basis for theological proof or doctrinal argument. Let me say that again. Only the literal sense. The spiritual senses are fine for preaching. They're useful for devotion, but you cannot build formal theology on them. This was radical. Aquinas was saying the Quadriga is fine for sermons, but when you're doing serious theological work, we must stick to the literal meaning. Why? Because the literal sense is objective. It's based on the grammar, the syntax, the historical context. It's controllable. It's verifiable. The spiritual senses are subjective. They depend on the interpreter's creativity. Aquinas also clarified something important. He said the spiritual senses don't come from the words. They come from the facts. Here's what that means. The historical fact of the Exodus is real. God literally delivered Israel from Egypt. That's the literal sense. But that historical fact also points forward. It signifies the liberation of the church from sin, and it signifies our ultimate liberation into glory. So the spiritual meanings aren't arbitrary. They flow from the historical reality, and they have to be confirmed by other scripture. That's typology, not allegory. And there's a massive difference. Aquinas restored the unique argumentative authority of the literal sense, and even though the Quadriga persisted in popular preaching, his work prepared the intellectual landscape for the Reformers. Because here's what the Reformers did. They said, if only the literal sense is argumentative, why keep the other three? Let's just get rid of them. And that's exactly what Luther and Calvin did. They discarded the spiritual senses entirely and went back to the Antiochian method. The literal sense is the only sense. The author's intent is the meaning. Context controls interpretation. So here's why all this matters for you. The Quadriga is still alive today. You probably don't hear people use the Latin terms, but you hear the method all the time. Every time a preacher pulls 4 different meanings out of one verse, that's the Quadriga. Every time someone says, yes, but what does it mean to you spiritually? That's the allegorical sense overriding the literal. Every time someone ignores the historical context and jumps straight to, what's the lesson for my life? That's the moral sense, detached from the authorial intent. Every time someone says, this really points to heaven without any textual warrant, that's the anagogical sense being imposed. And here's the danger. When the text can mean multiple things at the same time, it loses its authority. You can make it say whatever you need to say in the moment. The Reformation fought against that. The Reformers said the text has one meaning, the meaning the author intended. Our job is to discover that meaning through careful grammatical historical exegesis. So here's your challenge this week. Listen for the Quadriga. Pay attention to sermons and small groups and commentaries. Ask yourself, is this interpretation based on the plain meaning of the text in its historical context, or is the speaker layering additional meanings on top of the literal sense? And here's the second part. Pick one passage where you've heard multiple interpretations. Go back and do the work. What did this mean to the original audience? What is the single intended meaning based on the grammar and context? You might find the literal meaning is richer and more challenging than all 4 levels of the Quadriga combined. Drop a comment and let me know what you discover. And make sure you subscribe, because the next video, we're jumping into the Reformation. We're going to see how sola scriptura changed everything, how Luther and Calvin brought back the Antiochian method and sparked a revolution in biblical interpretation. If you want to go deeper, I'm offering free early access to the full biblical hermeneutics course. Head to BibleStudySteps.com to join the beta testing program. You'll get the complete course, all the resources, and the chance to shape how we teach this material. Link is in the description. I will see you in the next one.